In this chapter, we're going to have a quick look at modifiers and the stack. Both of these are major concepts that are pivotal to the architecture of 3ds Max. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, and that's because TG Academy has an entire DVD that was authored by me that deals with the stack and how it can be used to enhance your workflow and rigs in 3ds Max. It's called Proceduralism. It deals very heavily with the stack and modifiers and so on and so forth. So if you want to get into that in a lot of detail, I recommend looking at that DVD. But what I will do here is quickly give you a boiled down outline of what the stack is and how modifiers work within it. Modifiers are modular tools that are designed to change an object in 3ds Max in some way. When I say an object, I mean a single geometrical node, something like a cube or a cylinder or a scan mesh, something like that. These modifications are varied, and some deal with the physical shape of the object. Others allow you to modify the object's mapping coordinates, whilst others allow you to create complex deformation systems, and these can be used in effect to create complex character rigs for animation. As I said, modifiers are modular in that they are designed to work with each other. In many cases, the output of one modifier can go on to change the way a second modifier works. An example of this are the mesh editing modifiers. These allow you to select only certain object elements and then pass those on to other modifiers for them to make their own changes. One thing that's important to bear in mind about a modifier is that their reference transform system is based on the object or the objects that they're actually applied to. This means that, for instance, a bend modifier, when it's applied, is designed by 3ds Max to apply a correct bend deformation to the geometry of the object which it's applied to. It's effectively tailored to the local transform space of the actual object that it's applied to. And this is very different to the way that space warps work. Space warps work in world space, whereas modifiers work with local space. Anyway, we'll look at space warps later in this DVD, so let's get back to looking at modifiers for now. Okay, so an object can have multiple modifiers applied to it. As I said, they're modular, so you can actually have multiple modifiers to apply to one object. In fact, you could have 30, 40, 50 modifiers. And this means that some form of management system is needed to structure just what modifiers are applied to an object, what order they're applied in, and how those effects happen. And this is a very key feature of the whole modifier system. In Maya, for instance, a more complex non-linear system is used to apply modifications. And in my opinion, this is both a boon and a curse, because in Maya, modifications can be very complex, and there's a non-linear graph which can basically look like a cat's cradle of connections between one modifier and another modifier. And it can be very difficult sometimes to work out exactly how all of these different modifiers work together to give you the final object that you have. So it can actually be much more difficult to understand than 3ds Max. Maybe there's more flexibility there, but you really have to be a super advanced user to actually use it effectively. In 3ds Max, you have what I would say is a much more elegant solution, which is the stack, and it's a linear system, so possibly maybe not as flexible in the long run, but it does mean that the average user can use those modifiers in the stack, and they can see very easily exactly what the modification is that they're going to end up with. So let's look at applying some modifiers now, and then we can also see the stack in action at the same time. So I'm going to get this cylinder here. You can see at the moment it's just a primitive. It's going to turn on wireframe here so you can see the polygons of the object a little bit more clearly and the tessellation values. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a bend modifier on here. Just choose the bend modifier. And let me have a look at some other modifiers that might make a little bit of sense. Maybe an FFD modifier. Let's just use a 3x3. I think that'll do for now. So we can see now that we have an object and it has multiple modifiers applied to it. And we can see that on the control panel here, we have what is called a stack for the object. The stack is simply a list of modifiers for that object, and the list goes from the bottom up, and it's linear. This means that the bottommost modifier is applied to the object first, then the one above it, and then the one above that, and so on, until 3ds Max reaches the top of the modifier stack, and at the top of the stack, the object is displayed in its currently modified state. The great thing about the stack is that the order in which modifiers are applied is obvious. Also, the stack maintains each modifier as being discrete to the ones below or above it. If you want to, you can grab a modifier and delete it, move it up and down the stack, turn it off, back on, so on and so forth. In certain circumstances, you can't do that, and that's something we'll show a little bit later. But generally, you can move modifiers freely around inside the stack. So the stack is the interface that allows us to work with our modifiers once they have been applied to an object. So let me just quickly run you through the different features of the stack here. So firstly, we have the stack window, which you can see here, and it shows the tube primitive, which you can see here at the base of the stack. Then we have a bend modifier applied, and then we have a freeform deformation modifier applied. Now, at the moment, I've not actually done anything with those modifiers, so the cylinder actually looks exactly the same as it did without the modifiers applied. It's very easy to reorder modifiers. You just drag them, and you can just move them around. There we are, I've just reordered those two. And it's also very easy to delete modifiers. You can just select a modifier, click on the little bin icon here, and that will actually delete the modifier. Just press Ctrl Z to undo that. And it's also possible to turn off the effect of a modifier. If you want to temporarily turn it off, you can just click on the light bulb here. You can see when it's grayed out, it has no effect. And I can click that and turn it back on again. And another feature which I'm going to show you is something which actually I didn't see in Max until I'd been using it for quite a while. And I saw a demonstration by an Autodesk demonstration employee, and he did this very quickly. And it was like, what was it that you just did there? And he went back and showed us, the group of people that were looking at this demonstration, and it was one of those I don't mean a pun here, but it was one of those light bulb moments where you suddenly realize that you've been missing something all along. Anyway, enough waffle. Let's show you what it is. If you right click on the light bulb, you can see you've got extra options, and you can see that at the moment the light bulb is on. You can also turn it off here, same as before. But you'll notice there were a couple of other options, and you can see you can turn off the modifier only in the viewport, or you can turn it off only in the renderer. So that means that you can have the object modified when you're working with it in the viewport, but when it comes to rendering, it turns off the modifier. And you can have the opposite happen. You can actually have it off in the viewport when you're working, and then when it renders, it turns the modifier on. And that's great for certain modifiers. Tessellation modifiers, which it's going to tessellate the object massively. You don't really want that when you're working with it in the viewport generally. But when it comes to render time, you do. So you can actually choose this option off in the viewport, and then at render time, modifier comes on and tessellates the object. And some of these tessellation modifiers have the option to kind of do that within the modifier, but it's actually much better to turn off the modifier in the viewport, because that way the modifier doesn't get evaluated whatsoever. And that therefore the speed of that particular object in 3ds Max is actually much faster. So it achieves the same result, but it actually does it in a more efficient manner by actually turning off in the viewport. So that's a pretty cool feature. So anyway, let me show you one of these modifiers in action. I'll just put this freeform deformation back to the top. We'll leave it turned off for now. And I'm just going to go in and click on this bend. And immediately you'll see this orange box, and that's actually called a gizmo, and it actually shows the deformation field, as it were, of this bend modifier. A lot of modifiers have two things. They have a pivot point, which you can see here is called a center, and they have a gizmo, and that basically shows you the center of their deformation and the area of their deformation. And that is actually based on the local transform space of the object, which is why modifiers are based on, as I said, local space. And then you can see that this gizmo is actually constrained to the sort of bounding box of the cylinder. So that's how it kind of works that out. Now, this particular modifier is a bend modifier. It bends the object. So I'll just choose an angle here. We'll bend the cylinder over, and you can see the gizmo shows you quite clearly how the bend should look as you bend it over. Now, in this case, this particular cylinder doesn't actually have enough tessellation along its height to give you the full quality of the bend. But this is the really cool thing about the stack, because you can actually go down to the primitive definition and we can change the height segment. So this actually will increase the tessellation along the height. So I'll just add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there we are. We've actually added quite a bit of tessellation along the height of the tube, and it's actually allowed it to bend much more nicely. It actually looks much better. We can go back up to the bend now and bend it over in that direction. We can choose the direction of the bend. So you can see that that makes a lot of sense. And if I just turn off this modifier, I can go up to this modifier, I'll turn it on, and the freeform deformation system creates a lattice around your object. And in this case, you have to go in and select the control points of the lattice to do the deformation. So I can grab these control points here, and I can deform the object by pulling these around. I can just select these here, pull these down, and let's say we want to pull these up here. So as you can see, it's created its own sort of little gizmo, this lattice, and you can use this lattice to deform the object in various ways. You can just select whatever control points you want to, and then deform the tube in various ways. I've been showing these in isolation, but if I go in and turn on the bend modifier, you'll actually get quite a different result now. So you can see you're getting actually a very deformed looking kind of mesh here. And that's because what we actually did was we bent the mesh and then we applied the FFD. So, if we wanted to, we could actually change the relationship here, and we could actually apply the FFD and then the bend. And that actually, in this case, gives us a much kind of cleaner looking result here. So the order in which we apply modifiers does actually have an effect on the end result. Putting the bend before the FFD is going to give us quite a different result to putting the bend after the FFD. And obviously, if we turn off the bend, we're just going to get the result of the FFD. And if we just turn on just the bend, we're just going to get the bend result. So the order that we do things in the stack does make a difference. There is a proceduralism to it. There's a procedure that we're actually carrying out. And that's why the DVD on this subject is called proceduralism. Generally, as I said, modifiers are modular, and you can do something with one modifier and then do something with another modifier, and they're not really going to affect each other. But there are exceptions to that rule, and it does make a big difference the way that you use modifiers. Easiest way to see this is if I demonstrate it. So I'm just going to get rid of this FFD, and I'm just going to leave us with a bend. And if you think about a scenario where you might want to actually limit the bend to just a certain part of this tube, well, you can actually do that in 3ds Max by making a selection of just a certain part of the geometry and then passing that on to the next modifier in the stack. So to do that, we need some kind of way of selecting the geometry. So some of the modifiers, for instance, I think you've got poly select and mesh select. You've got mesh select here, and you've got poly select here. They allow you to actually select certain parts of these objects. What they also do is they convert this object from a primitive into either an edit mesh by using mesh select, or an editable poly when you use poly select. And that has a different result to the way the geometry is treated from then on. So for now, we don't really want to dwell too much on the differences between those two. So I'm just going to use poly select, and you can see when I do so, we've got this button turned off here. What that actually does is it limits you to seeing only what the stack has done up to the point that you've got selected. So as an example, if we click on tube, we see the result of, actually let me just turn that off, result of the tube. Then we click on poly select, we see that. Then we click on bend, and we see the bend modifier kicks in. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to poly select, and I'm going to just select the top vertices of this tube here. You can see I've done that pretty well. And what I'm going to do now is I'm not going to click off here. I'm going to stay in this sub-object mode when I'm working with edges and borders and so on, and vertices. And I'm going to take this selection of vertices and pass them on to the bend modifier. And you can see what happens now is just the vertices that I've selected get bent by the modifier. And I can go back in the stack, I can go back down, and I can change the selection. Let's say I grab these vertices here instead, and I can pass that back up to the stack. And you can see now that only these vertices get affected by the bend modifier above. I can go back down again, and you can see that the selection is actually symbolized by these little vertices here. It shows you that a selection is being passed up the stack. I can go back down to here. I can select edges, select these edges here, and go back up to bend. And you can see now that only those edges are being passed on. So the edges are being passed on as the form of selection. And then I can choose polygons, choose some polygons, pass those on, and again the symbol changes. So in each case it's showing you that some kind of selection, either vertices, polygons, or edges, are being passed on up the stack. So if I go back down to poly select some vertices again, and I'm going to just select the top 2 rows here this time of vertices. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then I'm going to pass that on to the bend, and as you can see, bend modifiers just bent those top 2 rows of vertices. Now, that in itself is a pretty cool feature, but what makes 3ds Max really cool is that we can actually go down here and we can turn on a thing called soft selection, and we've got this option here to use a soft selection or not. And what a soft selection is as you can see here, this is a pretty hard selection. You know, we select these vertices and only these vertices get affected by the modifier above, which is pretty limited. But if we turn on a soft selection, we get this shaded effect here, we get this rainbow effect. And what this shows is that the red vertices will have 100% effect applied to them, and blue vertices have 0%. Now, at the moment, the range of this soft selection is actually quite large. It's using 20 units. But I can just grab the spinner and pull it down, and you can see it changes the size of the soft selection. And as I said, when you see this dark blue, that means that you've got 0 effect at that point. So what I want to do is I just want to bend this cylinder just from the top down to the middle here. So I'm just going to pull this until I get the blue coming into there. And what that should do is now it should be 100% here, 0% here, and 0% from then on. And if I then pass that on up the stack, as you can see, it's deforming these vertices at 100%, and then you get this nice fade out because of this soft selection. It's a really cool feature. And if I just go down in the stack, I can make a different selection. You've got the soft selection there, go back up, and again, you've got that bend being applied just that area there. And it doesn't have to be, you know, just a continuous selection. It can actually be different selections. And in each one, you get this fall off taking place. So as you can see, I can pass that up the stack. And as you can see, the deformation takes place just on the areas where we have the soft selection. I can go down, I can change the size of the fall off so they kind of connect up a bit more, go back up, and there you see it's got much more of an effect now, but these areas here are still not deformed whatsoever along here. The other thing is, you know, I've turned off this icon, and what that does is as you can see, it says show end result on off toggle. And what that does is, and you can probably imagine by the name, is it actually stops you seeing what happens above a modifier in the stack. Now in this case, I want to see that happen, and when that happens, when I make a modification, it'll be interactive. So let's go down to poly select, and you can see as you can't actually see what happens above in the stack. But if I turn on this icon now, you can actually see the modification. And the original mesh, which is actually on this level, you can see is actually shown as an orange kind of ghost. Now, when I deselected there, that actually deselected all of the vertices in the object. And if I just select this vertex, you can see that gets passed on. This vertex, you can see I can actually add vertices to the selection here interactively. You can see as I do it, you can see it's actually passing that selection up the stack. So, and that's in real time. I can change the fall off, and it's going to show me the difference in the end result in real time. You can actually see what's happening in real time. It's showing you the end result of the stack. So I can go up here, I can bend it. Then let's say I want to change the object again. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to twist the object. So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to choose twist. There we go. And I'm going to just twist the object around. But I think you can see that it's not a uniform effect, and that's because the selection is being passed on. So what we want to do is we want to isolate this twist modifier from this vertex selection. The easiest way to do that is to go down to the bend modifier and apply another modifier which actually gets rid of that selection. We'll just go to poly select again, choose that. We're not going to go into sub-object mode and choose any vertices. We're just going to leave it as is, and that deselects all the vertices, which means that when we go up to the twist, all of the vertices are twisted in the object, as you can see. So we're not passing on that selection. So by using these poly select and mesh select modifiers, we can actually terminate a sub-object selection in the stack. We can stop it being propagated on from one modifier to the next modifier. As you can see, you've got some really cool control here with the modifiers and stack system in 3ds Max. And the other great thing about the stack is it allows you to modify an object in a non-destructive manner. Let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to actually go in now and let's get rid of this twist and this poly select. I'm going to do edit, let's say edit poly. And at this point that actually converts the geometry into an edit poly object. And what I can do now is I can actually go in and I can select these vertices. I can move them around if I wish. I'm going to change this from parent space and I'm going to change it into local space. Actually, let me turn it into world space. There we go. And I'm going to change this option here. You can see that these options also work on sub selections. I'm just going to make the gizmo a little bit larger so you can see it more easily. And I can then move around that vertex in 3D space. Now, the other thing I can do, which is really cool, is we've got soft selections again. So I can turn on soft selections, and I can make them the size that I want them to be. And then I can choose a vertex, and I can move it, and I can actually deform the tube a little bit more by using these soft selections. So I can pull things in here, and move things around. I can change the type of the soft selection. I can actually make it pinched, so it has a really sort of rapid fall off. I can make it a bit larger. Now I can actually sort of pull out little sort of peaks. Let me just pull this out here. So I pulled out a little sharp peak there. Do the same here. Pretty cool, eh? And the really nice thing is that this modification is taking place inside this modifier. So I can come out of sub-object mode. Let me just drag this down so I can come out of sub-object mode. And I can go down to the bend modifier. And you can see there's just the bend. And then I can go down to the poly select. There's the poly select. And then I can go back up to the bend. And I can go back up to the edit poly. And I can see the modifications that are being made at each point. In each point, you know, it actually shows me the modifications of the stack. I can go back down to the primitive, and there's the basic primitive. And I can show end result, and then it'll show me the entire stack, no matter where I am within the totality of it. So you've got the option to isolate the modifications to just the modifier that you're looking at, and obviously everything that comes before it, or you can actually look at the totality of the modifications of the stack all at the same time, all the time, by using this button here. I toggle it off, again, we can just look at the stack up to that point. So you got a really cool system there. Now the nice thing is let's say we went into edit poly, we didn't like some of these faces here. Let's say I don't like these. I'm just going to delete these, and I'm going to get some of these faces here. I'm going to get rid of those, just kill those off. And let's say later we look at our object and we go, well, you know, actually that wasn't such a good idea. I really didn't want to, you know, get rid of those faces there. You can actually dump all of the modifications that you've made with this modifier. You can either turn it off temporarily, or you can just delete it. And when you delete it, you go back to the previous modifier in the stack in the previous state, and all your faces are back. So you can see that's another really cool feature of the stack. It allows you to isolate modifications to certain areas of the stack by using, you know, a stack of modifiers. Each one is discrete, and you can go in, and if you don't like a modifier, you can actually remove it, as long as it isn't passing on, let's say, a selection to a modifier above. If it doesn't do that, it's basically distinct from the modifier above, so you've got the option of removing it, obviously with certain caveats in mind. before we finish off, there's one more thing that I've got to show you, and that is when I use the modifier edit poly, we at that point turn this object into an editable poly. If I used a edit mesh modifier, at that point we turn the object into an editable mesh. And the really cool thing is about these modifiers is that you can go back and you can change them, and you can actually change it from an edit mesh into an edit poly, back into an edit mesh, back into an edit poly, back and forth, each one of those making the change from one geometry type to another. But you can also bake all of the changes that you have in an object into the object and get rid of the stack at any point. And to do that, you just click on the object, right click on it, and it comes up with this menu. And you can see down the bottom we have convert to, and that allows us to convert the object to any logical geometry type for the geometry that you've got selected. So you can see that you've got the option here to convert it to an editable mesh, convert it to an editable poly, convert it to an editable patch. I'll click on mesh and keep an eye on the stack over here when I do this. There you go. You can see the stack disappears, and you can see that it now says that it's an editable mesh, and all the modifiers have disappeared, and also the primitive definition has disappeared. It's now not a tube anymore, it's just an editable mesh. We'll just undo that, and we're back to our stack again. It's one of those things that sometimes you may need to do. You may need to collapse the stack because you really don't need any of the modifiers anymore, but it can be a really good idea to only do that in a version of your file where that's an explicit decision that's been made. For instance, you might have, say, 10 versions of a model, all with their modifiers applied, and then in the end you need to deliver that to the client. He doesn't need all the clutter of all those modifiers. It's just going to confuse him, or it's just going to make his scene slow. So you can then go into your objects and you can either convert them individually or en masse into editable meshes, editable polys, patches, whatever that you want to convert them into. You have the option to convert an object into an editable poly, mesh, NURBS, patch using modifiers, or you can also do it by right-clicking and using the convert option. So you can turn it into an editable poly just by using that option. But it's a really cool idea if you can to stick with your conversions by using a modifier, because you've always then got the option of going back and changing it at a later time. But of course, as I said, when you need to pass around to a client or something like that, you may not want that complication, and that's when convert comes into play. When you might have used, say, 30 or 40 modifiers on a mesh when you've model a character, but when you come to rig it, you're then going to put even more modifiers on to create that character, and that means that the stack, to evaluate the entire stack, 3ds Max is it's going to become really, really slow. So what you do is you can actually collapse the stack by converting, getting rid of all those modifiers, turning the mesh into a much simpler object, into a very simple edit mesh or edit poly, and then you can then take that mesh on and then use it in the rigging process. You can also collapse the stack up to a point. You can right click and then you can say collapse to, and that will actually collapse it up to that modifier and keep all the modifiers above. So you've got an awful lot of flexibility in the stack, and you've got a vast amount of flexibility with modifiers. There's just too many for me to go into, but they are actually organized into different groups. You can actually right click here and you can say show all sets in list, and then you can go in here. You can actually have them then organized into different modifiers that do different things. So you've got mesh editing modifiers, so these are all to do with modeling. You've got animation modifiers, these are all basically for either rigging or for animation. UV coordinate modifiers, these are for mapping. So when you're modeling, you're not going to be using all of these. You're probably going to be using, parametric modifiers, bend, taper, twist, noise, stretch, squeeze. These are all very useful for modifying. And then you may want to use these conversion modifiers to convert the object into a poly or into a patch or a mesh. And also, you can use mesh editing while you're modeling, obviously. And you can also use the mesh select and patch select and poly select that I showed you earlier to just select certain parts of an object to pass that on in the geometry. So, there's a lot of different things you need to learn there. This DVD really doesn't have the time to go through every single feature, every single modifier. So you're just going to have to look at the online help, look at each modifier and evaluate each one and see whether it fits into your modeling pipeline. Even modifiers which are meant for rigging can actually be used to deform a mesh, and therefore, they can be treated as modeling tools if you want to. You can create a very simple bone system and then deform a mesh using that bone system. So you can treat that rigging modifier as a modeling tool. So, you've got to be creative again with all these different modifiers. They all do different things. As you can see, the stack is a modular and a linear system that allows us to change our objects in a non-destructive way. You can use the plethora of modifiers to change your object in many different ways, and if you leave your stack intact, you can always come back later and make changes and tweak things to your heart's content. It's a really cool system in that respect. Of course, it's not always as simple as that, and as I said, please view our intermediate workflow DVD on proceduralism, where the stack is explored in detail and it explains a lot of the ins and outs of working with a stack and where you can get into trouble. The stack and the modifier system is pretty much unique to 3ds Max, and it's one of, or if not the major feature of the package, so it's really worth exploring if you want to get the most out of 3ds Max. It goes way beyond modeling. It's used for so many different things: animation, rigging, texturing. But I think what I've shown you here will give you an idea of its power and its importance in most modeling workflows.